The dust of the Hopewell station platform clung to Elara Vance's worn skirts, a gritty premonition of the judgment already settling upon her like a shroud. She had wagered her last ounce of fading hope on a man she'd never seen, a name scrawled on a piece of paper procured from a dog-eared catalogue, a promise whispered across 1,000 miles of steel track and desperate nights. And now, as the train, a great, smoke-belching beast, groaned and hissed to a reluctant halt, she felt the town's eyes boring into her back, sharp as shattered glass, cold as the wind that whipped across the unforgiving plains. Hopewell. The name was a cruel jest, she often thought, for a place that offered so little of its namesake to those who truly needed it. Elara, owner of the sun-scorched, debt-ridden Stone Creek Ranch, a legacy of her father's sweat and broken dreams, was one such soul. At 32, she was considered a spinster, an oddity, a woman who preferred the silent company of her few remaining cattle and the whispering cottonwoods along the creek to the hollow pleasantries of the town's small society. Her hands were calloused from work no woman was supposed to do alone, her face weathered by a sun that knew no mercy and a solitude that bit deep. The advertisement for a mail-order husband had been an act of quiet desperation, a final gamble against the encroaching wolves of poverty and loneliness. The town knew. Oh, how they knew. Mrs. Albright, the postmistress with a tongue sharper than her spectacles, had made sure of that. The snickers had followed Elara down Main Street for weeks, the pitying glances, the outright scorn. Now, they had all gathered, a vulture's welcome, to witness her presumed folly made manifest. The train door shuddered open, and a conductor, his face impassive, stepped down, placing a small stool. Elara's breath hitched. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. One passenger. Two. Then, a figure emerged, silhouetted for a moment against the dim light of the carriage before stepping onto the platform. A collective intake of breath, quickly followed by a ripple of derisive murmurs, washed over Elara. This was not the sturdy farmer, the hopeful homesteader she had dared to imagine, even in her most pragmatic moments. The man standing before them, blinking in the harsh afternoon sun, was clad in little more than rags. His clothes, thin and torn, hung from a gaunt frame as if from a scarecrow left too long in a barren field. Dust and grime seemed to be ground into his very skin. His dark hair was matted, his face shadowed by exhaustion and something deeper, a sorrow that seemed to emanate from his bones. He carried no carpet-bag, no worldly possessions save for the air of utter desolation that clung to him. Beaumont Croft, the portly, self-important owner of the mercantile, a man who had made unwelcome overtures towards Elara and her land in the past, let out a loud, braying laugh. "Well, now, Elara," Croft boomed, his voice dripping with malice, "looks like you scraped the bottom of the barrel and found the splinters." His cronies echoed his cruel amusement. Elara felt a flush of humiliation so intense it threatened to buckle her knees. This was worse, far worse, than she could have ever envisioned. Her gamble had not just failed, it had spectacularly imploded, making her a public spectacle of ruin. The man, Gideon Cole, according to the letter that had confirmed his departure, slowly raised his head. His eyes, sunken and dark, swept over the jeering crowd, expressionless, before they found Elara. They were eyes that had seen too much, endured too much. There was no plea in them, no shame, only a profound weariness and, beneath it, a flicker of something unreadable, a deep, still water that a stone, once dropped, would never find the bottom of. For a long moment, their gazes held. The laughter faded, the whispers died, as if the very air held its breath. In that silence, Elara saw past the rags, past the grime, past the town's suffocating judgment. She saw a fellow traveler in hardship, a soul as battered by the world as her own. And in that instant, a strange, defiant resolve solidified within her. She had paid for this man, such as he was. He was hers, and she was his, by agreement. To turn him away now would be to validate every cruel jibe, to admit defeat not just for herself, but for him too. Straightening her shoulders, Elara Vance, spinster of Stone Creek Ranch, took a step forward, her worn boots making a soft sound on the wooden platform, a sound that seemed to resonate with an unexpected finality. She ignored Croft's sneering face, ignored the aghast stares. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but clear, cutting through the thick disdain. Mr. Cole?" she asked, her gaze steady on his. The man gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "I am Elara Vance," she paused, then added, with a strength she hadn't known she possessed, "Welcome to Hopewell." "My wagon is this way." She turned, without waiting for a reply, and began to walk towards the dilapidated buckboard parked at the edge of the station yard, the fate of two broken people trailing behind her like the long, desolate shadows of the late afternoon sun. The journey to Stone Creek Ranch was steeped in a silence as vast and empty as the prairie stretching out around them. Gideon Cole sat beside Elara on the hard wooden seat of the buckboard, his posture unnervingly still, his gaze fixed on the distant, hazy horizon where the sky met the parched earth. He had not spoken a word since her greeting at the station, had merely followed her to the wagon, his movements slow, deliberate, as if each one cost him a piece of some dwindling reserve. Elara, too, found no words. What could be said? The chasm of their circumstances, the raw wound of their meeting, was too wide, too fresh for the flimsy bridge of polite conversation. The land itself seemed to mirror their internal desolation. It was late summer, the grasses bleached to a pale gold, the earth cracked and thirsty. The creek that gave the ranch its name was a mere trickle, winding its way through heat-blasted stones. Her father had poured his life into this unyielding soil, dreaming of green pastures and fat cattle, but the land had taken more than it gave, leaving behind a legacy of debt and heartache that now rested squarely on Elara's slender shoulders. As they crested the last rise, the ranch came into view, a small, weathered cabin, its porch sagging like a tired old man, a barn leaning precariously to one side, and a collection of corrals in desperate need of repair. It was not much, a stark testament to years of struggle. Elara felt a familiar pang of shame, wondering what this stranger, already so bereft, must think of this meager offering. Gideon's gaze swept over the homestead, slow and methodical, lingering on the dilapidated structures, the parched garden patch, the endless expanse of unforgiving land. His expression remained unreadable, a mask of weary endurance. When Elara finally pulled the weary horse to a halt before the cabin, the silence stretched, taut and heavy. She climbed down, her limbs stiff. "This is it," she said, her voice little more than a whisper, gesturing vaguely at the scene. Stone Creek. Gideon slowly dismounted, his movements economical, hinting at a hidden strength despite his gauntness. He stood for a moment, simply observing, as if committing every detail to memory. Then, without a word, he walked towards the water trough, pumped a small amount of murky water into his cupped hands, and drank. The first few days passed in a strange, almost surreal quietude. Gideon Cole was a ghost in her landscape, a silent presence that moved with a quiet purpose Elara found both unsettling and, to her surprise, faintly reassuring. He slept in the barn, on a pile of old straw she'd pointed out, refusing her hesitant offer of a blanket for the cabin floor. He ate what little she offered, stale bread, a thin stew, without comment, his gratitude expressed not in words but in the way his haunted eyes would briefly meet hers before returning to his plate. And he worked. From the first dawn, he was up, moving with a tireless energy that belied his ragged appearance. He didn't ask what needed doing, he simply saw and did. A broken gate was mended with salvaged wire and a sturdy piece of weathered wood. A loose board on the porch was nailed securely back into place. He began clearing the tumbleweeds and thorny brush that had encroached upon the small yard, his movement steady, rhythmic, almost meditative. Elara watched him from the cabin window as she kneaded dough for their meager bread, or from the shade of the porch as she mended worn clothing. His hands, she noticed, were scarred and calloused, but there was a surprising deftness in them, a familiarity with labor that spoke of a life lived close to the earth, or perhaps to hardship itself. He spoke only when absolutely necessary, brief, functional utterances. Water buckets low axe need sharpening, yet there was no sullenness in his silence, no resentment. It was the quiet of a man who had learned that words were often futile, or perhaps dangerous. One morning, Elara found a small, tight bunch of stubborn prairie wildflowers, their colors a muted defiance against the dun landscape, sitting in a chipped tin cup on her rough-hewn kitchen table. She knew, without asking, that Gideon had left them. Her heart gave an unexpected little flutter. That evening, she ladled an extra spoonful of rabbit stew into his bowl, a silent acknowledgement. He looked up, his dark eyes holding hers for a fraction longer than usual, and a faint, almost imperceptible softening touched the grim line of his mouth. It wasn't a smile, not yet, but it was something akin to it, a momentary truce with the harshness of their existence. Ilara found herself caught in a current of conflicting emotions. Fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach whenever she thought of the town's judgment, of the utter strangeness of this man who now shared her desolate world. But a fragile tendril of something else was beginning to unfurl within her, a hesitant respect, a reluctant empathy. He was not what she had expected, not what the town saw. Beneath the rags, beneath the grime and the silence, there was a core of something solid, something resilient. She was beginning to realize, a man who knew how to endure. And perhaps, just perhaps, so was she. The wind whispered through the eaves of the cabin, a lonely sound, but tonight, it felt a little less like a lament, and a little more like a breath held in anticipation. The fragile piece of Stone Creek Ranch was inevitably shattered by the intrusion of the outside world. It came in the form of Beaumont Croft and two of his leering cronies, their horses kicking up dust as they rode brazenly into Ilara's yard one sweltering afternoon. Croft, resplendent in a too-tight waistcoat and a smug sneer, reined in his expensive gelding, deliberately trampling a patch of earth Gideon had recently cleared for a hopeful kitchen garden. Gideon was by the corral, mending a section of broken fence with surprising skill, his movements economical and precise despite his worn-out tools. He paused, his back to the newcomers, but Ilara saw the subtle tensing of his shoulders, the way his head lifted slightly, listening. Ilara stepped out onto the porch, her heart thumping a nervous rhythm against her ribs. "Mr. Croft," she said, her voice betraying more tremor than she liked. "What brings you here?" Croft's eyes, small and avaricious, flicked from Ilara to Gideon and back again, his lips curling in disdain. "Just checking on our newest resident, Ilara," he drawled, his gaze lingering on Gideon's ragged attire. "Found yourself a scarecrow, have you? Or is he one of them talking kind?" His companions snickered, their eyes filled with a crude, mocking amusement. Gideon slowly turned, his face impassive, his dark eyes meeting Croft's insolent stare. He said nothing, his silence a heavy, unyielding wall that seemed to infuriate Croft more than any retort could have. "He don't look like much," Croft continued, his voice rising. "Hardly the man to work a place like this. Reckon he cost you dear in that catalogue, Ilara? Or did they pay you to take him?" The insult hung in the hot, still air. Ilara felt a surge of anger, hot and fierce, surprising even herself. Before she could voice it, Gideon moved. Not aggressively, but with a quiet deliberation, he picked up a heavy length of discarded fence post, testing its weight in his scarred hand. His eyes never left Croft. The message was unspoken but clear. Croft's smirk faltered for a moment, his bluster dimming slightly in the face of Gideon's silent, unwavering regard. He clearly hadn't expected any form of resistance, however subtle, from the man in rags. He shifted in his saddle. "This place needs a strong hand, Ilara," Croft pressed, his tone shifting to one of false concern, though his eyes still held their predatory gleam. "A real man to make it thrive. Not a ghost," he gestured dismissively towards Gideon. It was then that Ilara found her voice, fueled by a protective instinct she hadn't known she possessed. "He is Gideon Cole," she stated, her voice surprisingly firm, "my husband. And this is our land." The words hung in the air, a declaration that stunned Croft into momentary silence. Even Gideon's head turned slightly, a flicker of surprise in his usually guarded eyes. He hadn't expected her to claim him so unequivocally, so publicly. Croft recovered quickly, his face darkening. "Husband," he scoffed. "A piece of paper don't make a man, Ilara. Especially not one that looks like he crawled out from under a rock." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, threatening tone. "You'll regret this, mark my words. This land will be mine, one way or another." With a final, contemptuous glare at Gideon, Croft wheeled his horse around and, followed by his snickering lackeys, galloped away, leaving a cloud of choking dust and unspoken threats in their wake. Ilara watched them go, her hands clenched at her sides. When she turned, Gideon was still standing by the corral, the fence post resting lightly in his grip. His eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw something beyond weariness in their depths, a spark of something. Gratitude? Or perhaps, just the faint acknowledgement of a shared enemy. The silence returned, but it was different now, charged with the residue of conflict and the unexpected solidarity of her words. Later that week, during a necessary trip to Hopewell for meager supplies, the chill from the townsfolk was palpable. Whispers followed Ilara and Gideon like biting flies. Cold shoulders at the mercantile, hushed conversations that ceased abruptly as they approached. Gideon walked beside her, his head held not high, but with a quiet dignity that seemed to infuriate their detractors even more. He saw the averted gazes, heard the thinly veiled insults directed at Ilara, and his jaw tightened, a muscle working almost imperceptibly. He said nothing, but Ilara felt the subtle shift in his presence, a protective aura forming around her. The world was pressing in, its cruelty and prejudice a constant, wearing force. But within the small, besieged confines of Stone Creek Ranch, something else was beginning to take root, something fragile yet tenacious, like a desert flower pushing its way through hardened clay. The simmering hostility from Beaumont Croft and his ilk soon escalated beyond mere words and glares. One morning, Ilara discovered the rope to their well had been deliberately frayed, nearly to the breaking point. A few days later, a section of newly mended fence was found torn down, allowing their few precious cattle to wander. These were petty acts of malice, designed to wear them down, to reinforce their isolation. Gideon repaired the damage silently, his expression grim, but his resolve, Ilara noted, seemed to harden with each new provocation. He began to sleep closer to the cabin, no longer in the barn, but on the porch itself, a silent, watchful guardian. The turning point came during a sudden, violent thunderstorm that swept across the plains with little warning. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing at the cabin, and rain lashed down in blinding sheets. In the midst of the tempest, a crack of lightning illuminated three figures on horseback, struggling against the storm but clearly heading towards the ranch, Croft's men. They were likely aiming to use the storm's cover to inflict more significant damage, perhaps spook the cattle into a stampede or even attempt something more sinister. Gideon was on his feet instantly, pulling Ilara back from the window. "Stay inside," he commanded, his voice low and urgent, devoid of its usual quietness. It was the first direct order he had ever given her. Before she could protest, he was out the door, disappearing into the maelstrom. Peering through the rain-streaked glass, Ilara saw him move with an astonishing speed and surety, not towards the barn where the cattle were sheltered, but towards a narrow ravine that cut through their land, a place where riders could be easily ambushed or their horses could lose footing in the mud. He seemed to know the land, to anticipate their path. What followed was obscured by the driving rain and darkness, punctuated by the angry shouts of men and the terrified whinnying of horses. Ilara clutched her hands together, her heart a frantic drum. It seemed an eternity before Gideon returned, drenched to the bone, his clothes torn in new places, a dark bruise blooming on his cheekbone, but otherwise unharmed. He carried a length of rope, cut cleanly. "They won't be back tonight," he said, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Their horses are scattered." One of them took a fall. He didn't elaborate, but the grim set of his jaw told its own story. Later, as the storm subsided, leaving behind a washed-clean world, he spoke, his voice quiet again, but laced with a weariness that went beyond physical exertion. "I was a soldier, Ilara," he said, staring into the flickering flames of the small fire she had built. "Fought in the war. Saw things, did things. Afterwards, there wasn't much call for men like me. Then I was accused of something. Something I didn't do." He paused, the silence heavy with unspoken pain. "Spent time in a place where rags were the least of your worries. When I got out, the letter about your advertisement, it was the only hope I had left." Ilara listened, her heart aching for the raw pain in his voice, for the injustices he had clearly suffered. The rags, the silence, the haunted eyes, it all fell into place. He was a man stripped bare by a cruel world, left with nothing but his integrity and a desperate need for a new beginning. She reached out, her hand hesitantly covering his rough, calloused one where it rested on the table. "You didn't have to claim me, Ilara," he said, his voice hoarse, his gaze finding hers. "Not after seeing me that day at the station." After hearing what Croft said, Ilara's fingers tightened on his. "I saw a man, Gideon," she replied softly, her voice unwavering. "Not his clothes. Not his past, until you chose to share it. I saw a man who needed a chance, just like I do." A profound stillness settled between them, a fragile bridge of understanding built across the chasm of their separate sorrows. The light from the fire danced in his dark eyes, and for the first time, she saw not just weariness or resolve, but a flicker of something akin to warmth, a nascent hope mirroring her own. The wind outside had died down to a gentle sigh, and the scent of rain-soaked earth filled the small cabin, a promise of renewal. The uneasy peace that followed the storm was short-lived. Beaumont Croft, humiliated by his men's failure and infuriated by Ilara and Gideon's continued resilience, was not a man to accept defeat gracefully. His desire for Ilara's land, coupled with his wounded pride, festered into a dangerous resolve. He gathered a larger group of his loyalists, men fueled by whiskey and a shared disdain for outsiders and defiant women. They descended upon Stone Creek Ranch at dusk, not with petty sabotage, but with torches and loud, menacing threats, their intentions horribly clear. "This is your last chance, Vance!" Croft bellowed, his face contorted with rage, the flickering torchlight casting demonic shadows. "Sign over the deed, or we'll burn this pathetic excuse for a ranch to the ground, with you and your scarecrow husband in it." Ilara stood on the porch, pale but resolute, Gideon a silent, powerful presence beside her. He had handed her the old, heavy shotgun her father had kept, its barrels gleaming dully in the torchlight. His own hands were empty, but his stance was that of a man ready to meet any onslaught. "This is our home, Croft," Ilara called out, her voice carrying over the crackle of their torches. "We're not leaving, then you'll burn," one of Croft's men screamed, hurling a torch towards the dry timbers of the barn. Gideon moved with the speed of a striking viper. He didn't intercept the torch, but instead, with a powerful shove, sent a half-filled water barrel cascading down the slight incline towards the barn wall, dousing the nascent flames just as they began to lick at the wood. Simultaneously, he let out a piercing whistle, a signal Ilara didn't understand until she heard an answering commotion from behind the cabin, the snorts and heavy hoofbeats of her normally placid bull, a creature Gideon had been patiently gentling for weeks. He had, she realized with a jolt, anticipated this, prepared for it. The bull, confused and angered by the noise and fire, charged not towards Croft's men directly, but into the open space between them and the cabin, a bellowing, formidable obstacle. The attackers, startled, fell back a step, their horses shying nervously. In that moment of confusion, Gideon acted. He didn't engage in a wild brawl. His movements were precise, targeted, disabling. He disarmed one man lunging with a pitchfork, using the man's own momentum against him. He sidestepped another, delivering a blow that sent the man sprawling. It was not the undisciplined violence of a cornered animal, but the controlled, effective defense of a trained soldier, a man fighting not for glory, but for survival, for the protection of what was his. Ilara, her fear a cold knot in her stomach, stood her ground, the shotgun held steady, though her hands trembled. She didn't fire, but her unwavering presence, her refusal to cower, was its own form of defiance. The fight was brutal but surprisingly swift. Croft, seeing his men faltering against Gideon's unexpected prowess and the terrifying presence of the bull, and perhaps unnerved by Ilara's steadfast shotgun, began to lose his bluster. He had anticipated cowering victims, not a coordinated, fierce defense. When two of his main cronies were incapacitated, their bravado evaporated. With a curse, Croft wheeled his horse. "This ain't over," he snarled, but the threat lacked conviction. He and his remaining men retreated, a disorganized, humiliated rabble disappearing into the gathering darkness, leaving behind only the smell of smoke and fear. Gideon stood, breathing heavily, amidst the scattered remnants of the attack. He had a shallow cut on his arm, and his face was grim, but his eyes, when they met Ilara's, held a fierce, protective light. He walked towards her, taking the shotgun gently from her trembling hands. "It's over for tonight," he said, his voice rough. And in the quiet aftermath, as the moon rose over the bruised and battered land, a new understanding settled between them. They had faced the worst together, and they had survived. The town marshal, a man named Elias Thorne, who had long turned a blind eye to Croft's bullying, finally arrived the next morning, drawn by rumors of the night's failed assault. He saw the evidence of the attack, heard Ilara's calm, factual account, and witnessed the quiet, unyielding strength of Gideon Cole. Perhaps it was the blatantness of Croft's actions, or perhaps a stirring of a long-dormant conscience, but Thorne finally acted. Beaumont Croft was publicly admonished and warned that any further harassment of the Coles would result in his arrest. The tide of public opinion, fickle as it was, began to turn. The story of the ragged mail-order husband who was more than he seemed, and the quiet spinster who stood by him, began to circulate, tinged now with a grudging respect rather than scorn. Stone Creek Ranch, though scarred, still stood. And under the vast, starlit sky, Ilara Vance and Gideon Cole, two outcasts bound by circumstance and forged in conflict, began to build not just a defense, but a future. The land, sensing their resilience, seemed to breathe with them, offering a silent promise of sustenance. Their hands met, calloused and capable, and in that touch was a bond stronger than any legal document, a love story written not in ink, but in shared survival and the quiet language of the heart. Years unfurled like the slow, steady turning of the seasons across the plains. Stone Creek Ranch, once a symbol of struggle and desolation, slowly, miraculously, began to thrive under the combined efforts of Ilara and Gideon Cole. The cabin, once sagging and forlorn, now stood straight and sturdy, its porch mended, a welcoming clematis vine twining up its posts, planted by Ilara's own hand. The barn, its timbers once threatened by fire, was solid, filled with hay and the contented sounds of healthy livestock. The fields, once parched and barren, yielded modest but steady crops, a testament to Gideon's tireless labor and his intuitive understanding of the stubborn land. He had a way with the earth, a patient, knowing touch that coaxed life from even the most unpromising soil. The creek, too, seemed to run a little fuller, its waters nourishing the small orchard Gideon had planted, its apple and peach blossoms a fragrant promise each spring. Ilara, no longer the haunted, solitary woman who had scanned the horizon with desperate eyes, moved with a quiet confidence. Her face, still weathered by the sun, was softened by an inner peace, her eyes holding a gentle light that mirrored the affection she felt for the man who had arrived in rags and become her world. She managed the ranch's small but growing accounts, her neat ledger a testament to their shared prosperity. She traded surplus produce in Hopewell, where she was now greeted not with scorn, but with a respectful nod, sometimes even a friendly smile. Mrs. Albright, the postmistress, still gossiped, but now her tales were tinged with a reluctant awe for the Coles of Stone Creek. Gideon remained a man of few words, but his silence was no longer that of a haunted outcast. It was the comfortable quiet of a man at peace, a man who had found his place, his purpose. His dark eyes, when they rested on Ilara, held a depth of love and devotion that needed no verbal expression. He was a constant, steady presence, his strength a bedrock upon which their life was built. They were rarely seen apart, a familiar sight as they worked their land side by side, moving in an easy rhythm born of years of shared toil and unspoken understanding. Beaumont Croft, diminished and largely ignored, had long since ceased to be a threat, his arrogance deflated by public opinion and the quiet, unyielding success of the couple he had tried to destroy. The story of Ilara Vance and Gideon Cole became a quiet legend in Hopewell and the surrounding territories. It wasn't a tale of grand heroism or dramatic pronouncements, but a simpler, more profound narrative, of courage found in desperation, of strength discovered in perceived weakness, of love blossoming in the unlikeliest of circumstances. They had proven that true worth was not measured by outward appearances or societal approval, but by the quiet integrity of the heart and the resilience of the human spirit. Their ranch became a small beacon of hope, a reminder that even the most barren ground could yield abundance if tended with care and devotion. Travelers would sometimes stop, asking for water or directions, and would be met with a quiet courtesy, perhaps a piece of Ilara's fresh-baked bread or some fruit from their orchard. They would leave with a sense of having brushed against something special, something real. Ilara and Gideon never sought accolades or attention. Their joy was in the land, in their work, in each other. Their love, born in the crucible of hardship and sealed by mutual respect, had not only endured but had deepened, becoming as rooted and vital as the ancient cottonwoods that lined Stone Creek. Theirs was a history written not in grand public records, but etched into the soul of the land they had redeemed, and in the quiet admiration of a community that had once spurned them. They had arrived at the Hopewell station as two broken souls, one in desperate hope, the other in literal rags, and from those unpromising beginnings, they had woven a tapestry of love and resilience that became a story for the ages, a testament to the enduring power of seeing beyond the surface, to the profound truth that sometimes, the greatest treasures are found in the most unexpected packages, and that love, in its purest form, could indeed make history, one quiet, steadfast heartbeat at a time. If this story of Ilara and Gideon, two souls who found strength in each other against the harsh judgment of the world, stirred something deep within your own heart, if you believe that true love sees beyond the superficial, that courage can blossom in the desolate places, and that redemption is always possible even when all seems lost, if you recognize the quiet power of resilience and the enduring worth found in those society often overlooks, then you have found a kindred spirit in these tales. These are stories about the unshakable human spirit, about finding light in the darkness, and about the kind of love that doesn't just survive, but rebuilds, redeems, and ultimately, triumphs. If these are the narratives that resonate with you, that inspire you, then you are in the right place. Subscribe now for more stories that celebrate the profound strength of the human heart and the enduring power of love against all odds. Join us, and let these fables of the outcast, these Western romances of the soul, continue to unfold.